Oh look, surprise, surprise.
Error! This tape is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming.
Even though I'm on fibre optic, hardwired in with an Ethernet cable, running at 3000 BP, whatever it is. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever other than the fact that I am being targeted and they are messing with the stream and they're messing with my computer. The fact that they're doing this, that this is happening, it should be an absolutely perfect stream. It should be a perfect stream. There's no reason for it not to be a perfect stream. Other than they just want to piss me off. They just want to make things difficult. They want me to give up. They want me to stop doing what I'm doing. I'm never going to stop doing what I'm doing. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? I'm never going to stop doing what I'm doing. I'm going to double down and do it 1,000 times harder. And the more you push it back against me, the more I will push back. I'm one of the most stubborn motherfuckers you'll ever meet in your entire life. Sitting here listening to frickin' criminals and paedophiles and groomers telling the rest of us that we're all sacks of whatever. I do apologise. This is Gurdjieff. This is supposed to be Gurdjieff. But look at this. They're buffering me for no reason whatsoever. So I can't do this. I'm watching it. I'm watching how bad this stream is. Error. YouTube's not receiving enough video. Yes, it is. You lying sacks of shit. Yes, it is receiving enough video. I can see it here on my fucking output. I can see it's sending you enough video. It's just your inferior software run by inferior people. Right, I'm just going to continue. I'm not going to let these assholes stop me from doing what I'm doing. Welcome to those of you that are in the chat. I see you've got 3 people in the chat and not chatting. Awesome. Right, this is Meetings with Remarkable Men. Gurdjieff. The material question. On the 8th of April 1924, the day of the opening in New York of a branch of the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man, a dinner in honor of Mr. Gurdjieff was arranged at one of the Russian restaurants there by his friends and by several pupils of the French branch. After dinner, most of those present went with Mr. Gurdjieff to the apartment of Mrs. R at 49th Street. Here, over coffee served by the amiable hostess and liqueurs obtained somehow by Dr. B, conversation continued until breakfast of the following day. Mr. Gurdjieff spoke mostly through interpreters. Mr. Liliantz and Madame Veselovsky, answering all kinds of questions that were put to him, chiefly of a philosophical character. Mr. Gurdjieff, during a brief interruption while we were eating watermelon, which came from Buenos Aires, and was a great rarity at that time of year, even in New York, Dr. B, the proprietor of a large, fashionable sanatorium, who had the reputation of being a practical man, suddenly returned to Mr. Gurdjieff with the following question. Could you tell us, sir, what are the means by which your institute exists, and approximately what is its annual budget? To our surprise, Mr. Gurdjieff's answer to this question took the form of a long narrative. As this story revealed an unsuspected aspect of the struggle he carried on throughout his life, I have undertaken to reproduce it insofar as possible exactly as it was told that day. I consulted other pupils who, like myself, had listened to the story with such interest and attention, and they remembered it in almost all its details. And I verified my text by comparing it with the notes of Mr. F, the stenographer who took down all Mr. Gurdjieff's talks and lectures in America, so that people who asked questions which had been asked before could simply read through what Mr. Gurdjieff had already said on these subjects and thus economize his time. Mr. Gurdjieff began as follows. The question you have put to me, esteemed doctor, has always interested a great many of the people who have become more or less acquainted with me. But until now, not finding it necessary to initiate anyone into this personal affair of mine, I have either not answered at all or have turned it aside with a joke. Moreover, there have already sprung up about this subject all sorts of comical legends, which clearly show the all-round idiocy of their inventors, and which are ever more and more embellished with fantastic details, as they circulate everywhere among parasites and idlers, no less idiotic, of both sexes. It is claimed, for example, that I received money from some occult centre in India, or that the Institute is maintained by a black magic organisation, or supported by the legendary Georgian prince Makransky, or that, among other things, I possess the secret of the philosopher's stone, and can make as much money as I wish by alchemical processes. Or even, as many have recently said, that my funds are supplied by the Bolsheviks, and much else of the same sort. And in fact, even the people closest to me do not know to this day exactly from where the money came from the colossal expenses I have borne for many years. I did not find it necessary to speak seriously about this question, that is, the material aspect of the existence of the Institute, because I had no illusions about the possibility of outside help, and considered conversation on the subject simply a waste of time, or, as is said, a pouring from the empty into the void. But today, to this question, which has been asked me so often, and it has already wearied me more than enough, I wish to reply, for some reason or other, not entirely jokingly, but somewhat more sincerely. My wish to reply more seriously today is, it seems to me, and I am almost certain, due to the fact that having become, by the will of fate, or rather through the stupidity of the power possessors in Russia, poor as a mouse, I have ventured to come to this dollar-growing country, and here, breathing this air saturated with the vibrations of people who sow and reap dollars in a masterly fashion, I, like a thoroughbred hunting dog, I, like a thoroughbred hunting dog, am on the scent of certain and good game, and I will not let the opportunity escape me. As I am now sitting here among you people who are fattened on what is called dollar fat, and feel myself stimulated by the automatic absorption of these beneficent emanations, I intend, by means of my reply, so to say, to shear some of you a little. Therefore, in the pleasant surroundings provided by a hostess of a hospitality so rare for the present day, I will make advantage of these fortunate circumstances to mobilize all the possibilities for the activity of my brain, as well as the capacities of my talking machine, and will reply to this question asked again today in such a way that each of you should begin to suspect that my pocket is, itself, a fertile soil for the growing of a dollar seed, and that in sprouting there these dollars acquire the property of bringing the sowers what could be, in the objective sense, their real happiness in life. Nigel, hey mate, sorry, just pause for a second. I just saw your comment. I really enjoyed that chat with Sterling yesterday, mate. It was absolutely brilliant. Sterling is he's a really nice guy. He's intelligent, and I like the fact that he's so, he seems very open-minded. I find it quite funny that every time he tried to disagree with me, he wanted to disagree with me, he even said it, he was trying really hard to dislike me, but he was finding it almost impossible to dislike me, so I take that as a compliment. Back to the book. And so, my dear, for the time being, unconditionally respected dollar holders, even long before I began putting my ideas into practice by means of my institute, that is, when I was first thinking out the program from every angle, I had carefully considered the material aspect, which, although secondary, was nevertheless very important. As I then expected to meet many obstacles in my effort to produce into life the psychological ideas upon which this establishment, extraordinary for the present day, would be based, I felt it necessary to be independent, at least in the material sense. The more so, since experience has already shown me that wealthy people never become seriously enough interested in these questions to support a work of this kind, and that others, even with great interest and desire, cannot do much in this respect. As for such an enterprise, a great deal of money is needed. Sasquatch, how you doing, buddy? That is why, if I wished to actualize in full what I had planned, it was necessary, before thinking of carrying out the psychological tasks, first of all to resolve this aspect of the problem. Therefore, with the aim of creating sufficient capital for this purpose, within a set period, I began to devote much more time than before to earning money. What I have just said must in all probability arouse complete perplexity in most of you Americans, who at the present time everywhere on earth are considered excellent businessmen. You must be wondering how it is possible with such ease to earn these presumably large sums, and hence you must surely have received the impression of a certain sort of bragging on my part. Yes, indeed, this must even sound very strange to you. In order that you may understand, if only approximately, why and how I was able to do this, and where I acquired such self-assurance, it is first of all necessary for me to explain that before this period of my life, I had often been engaged in all sorts of commercial and financial undertakings, and was already considered by all who came in contact with me in this sphere a very astute businessman. And further, I must tell you something of my upbringing, which, from my experienced point of view, corresponds most nearly to the ideal formed in me on the subject of education. Owing to this upbringing, I could then, perhaps, if required, can still today, go one better than any businessman whatever. and perhaps even the new American businessmen. It is particularly appropriate to tell you certain details of my education, since we are gathered today to celebrate the opening of an institution which has at its fundamental aim the correct, harmonious education of man. The more so, since this institution is based on experimental data accumulated over the course of many years and thoroughly verified by me, that very man who has sacrificed almost his whole personal life to the study of this vital question of education, so painful for the present day, and who, having been brought up by people with normally developed consciences, has been able to acquire the capacity, no matter what the means, no matter what the circumstances, always to be impartial. The strongest intentional influence exerted upon me was that of my father, who understood education in quite his own way. The strongest... reading live, remember, for the first time ever. Never read these words before, so just bear that in mind. I even intend at some time to write a whole book about all the direct and indirect methods of my father which ensued from his original views on education. As soon as there appeared in me the signs of more or less correct comprehension, he began, among other things, to tell me all kinds of extraordinary tales, which always led up to a series of stories about a certain lame carpenter, named Mustafa, who knew how to do everything, and one day even made a flying armchair. By this means, by other persistent procedures, my father fostered in me, along with the desire to be like this expert carpenter, the irresistible urge always to be making something new. All my childhood games, even the most extraordinary ones, were enriched by imagining that I was someone who did everything not as it is usually done, but in a quite special way. This tendency, as yet ill-defined, which my father inculcated in my nature from my earliest childhood, was in an indirect way, was later, in the first years of my youth, given a more definite form because of the ideas of my first teacher about education turned out to be, in certain respects, in keeping with it. And so, in addition to the fulfillment of my scholastic duties, I practiced various manual crafts and skills under his special instruction. Hey Squirrel, how you doing, buddy? The most characteristic educational procedure of my first teacher was that as soon as he noticed that I was becoming familiar with any particular craft and was beginning to like it, he immediately made me give it up and pass on to another. As I understood much later, his aim was not that I should learn all sorts of crafts, but should develop in myself the ability to surmount the difficulties presented by any kind of new work. And indeed, from that time on, work of every kind has sense and interest for me, not in itself, but only insofar as I did not know it and did not know how to do it. Good ATW, how you doing, buddy? In short, owing to their original views on education, these two men, who consciously or even unconsciously, in the present case it does not matter, had taken upon themselves my preparation for responsible age, engendered in my nature a certain subjective property which developed gradually as the years passed, and finally became fixed in the form of an urge frequently to change my occupation. As a result, I acquired, if only automatically, abilities of both theoretical and practical nature for carrying on various manual and commercial occupations. My comprehension also was gradually increased as my horizon widened in various fields of knowledge. I will add that if I am recognized today in different countries as a representative of true knowledge in many fields of learning, I owe it in part to this early education of mine. Thanks to the resourcefulness, breadth of view, and above all, common sense, developed in me by correct education, I was able to grasp from all the information I collected intentionally or accidentally in the subsequent course of my life, the very essence of each branch of learning, instead of being left with merely an accumulation of empty rubbish, which is the inevitable result among contemporary people of the general use of their famous educational method called learning by heart. And so, at an early age, I was already well equipped and able to earn sufficient money to provide for my immediate needs. However, as I had come to be interested, when still quite young, in those abstract questions which lead to an understanding of the sense and aim of life, and gave all my time and attention to this, I did not direct my capacities for earning money towards that self-sufficing aim of existence on which, owing to abnormal education, all the conscious and instinctive strivings of contemporary people, and particularly of you Americans, are concentrated. I turned to earning money only from time to time, and only insofar as it was needed for my ordinary existence, and to enable me to accomplish whatever is necessary for attaining the aim I had set myself. Coming from a poor family, and not being materially secure, I had to resort rather often to earning this indeed despicable and maleficent money for unavoidable needs. However, the process itself of earning money never took much of my time, because owing to the resourcefulness and common sense developed in me by correct education, sorry, hang on a sec. However, the process of itself of earning money never took much of my time, because, owing to the resourcefulness and common sense developed in me by correct education, I was already in all these life matters what might be called an expert, cunning old blade. As a very characteristic illustration of my capabilities in this direction, I will relate an episode in my life when one day, just offhand, for a small wager, I opened a very original workshop. The details of this episode will perhaps somewhat lengthen my present recital. Nevertheless, I think that, thanks to this marvellous liqueur, marvellous, by the way, because it was not made in the usual conditions established on earth, but at sea on an old barge off the coast of America, it will not seem too long or boring for you. Well then, it was not long before the last big expedition through the Pamir region and India, organised by the society we had formed, called the Community of Truth Seekers, of which I had been a member from the very beginning. About 2 years before the departure of this expedition, the members of the community decided to make their rallying point the town of Chadzu in the Trans-Caspian region. All those intending to participate in the expedition were to meet there on the 2nd of January of the year 1900, and from there, first of all, to move up along the course of the river Amu Darya. As quite a lot of time remained before this date, but not long enough for a long journey, I, being then in Alexandropol on one of my customary short visits with my family, did not go far away, as I usually did after spending the time I had reserved for them, but stayed on in the Caucasus, dividing my time between Alexandropol and Baku. I often went to Baku because there was a society there composed mostly of Persians who were studying ancient magic, of which I had been an associate member for a long time. The events which led to the episode which I intend to relate to you took place just in this town of Baku. One Sunday, I went to the bazaar. I must confess that I have always had a weakness for walking around in eastern bazaars, and whenever I stayed in a place where there was a bazaar, I would invariably go there. I very much like to rummage around in the odds and ends, where I always hope to come across something unusual. That day, I bought some old embroidery, and I was on my way out of the rag fair when I saw a well-dressed but very sorrowful-looking woman who had something to sell. I could see by everything about her that she was not a regular hawker, and was doubtless selling her wares from necessity. I went towards her and saw that she had an Edison phonograph for sale. The sad expression of the woman's eyes aroused pity in me, and although I had very little money, without taking time to think about it, I bought this useless machine with all its appurtenances. I carried this burden back to the canvasserai where I was living. I opened the box and found that it contained numerous rolls, most of which were damaged. Among those still intact, only some were recorded, the others were blank. I stayed in Baku several days longer. My resources were coming to an end, and I had to think about replenishing them. One overcast morning, I was sitting in bed, not yet dressed, pondering on how this was to be done, when I happened to glance at the phonograph. The idea of making use of it came into my head, and I at once drew up a plan of action. I liquidated all my affairs there, and that very day took the first boat leaving for the Trans-Caspian region. 5 days later, in the town of Krasnovodsk, sorry, reading live, remember? In the town of Krasnovodsk, I set my phonograph going to make money for me. It must be said that the phonograph was still unknown in this region, and it was the first time local inhabitants had seen this marvel. As I have said, there were also some blank rolls with the phonograph. I quickly found a Tekin street musician and got him to sing and play several of the favourite melodies of the local population, and on the remaining rolls I myself recorded a series of piquant anecdotes in Turkoman. Then I attached 2 additional ear tubes to the 4 that were already on the machine. You may remember that the first Edison phonographs had ear tubes, and set off with it to the bazaar, where I opened my original booth. I charged the price of 5 kopecks an ear tube, and you will be able to imagine the result if I tell you that during the whole time I was there, all day long, and particularly on market days, there was scarcely a moment when an ear tube was free. At the end of each day, the amount collected in 5 kopek pieces was probably not less than the profits of the biggest business in the town. After Krasnovodsk, I went to Kizil Arvat, and while there, I was invited several times to go with my machine to the houses of wealthy Turkomans in the neighbouring villages. For these request performances, I received a considerable quantity of tianji, and once even 2 very good Tekin carpets. When I had made a good pile again here, I took the train with the intention of continuing this business in the town of Ashgabat. But on the train I met one of the members of our community, with whom I made a wager, thanks to which this phonographical career of mine came to an end. The comrade I met was the inimitable and fearless Madame Vedvitskia, who always wore men's clothes. She had participated in all our perilous expeditions into the depths of Asia, Africa, and even Australia and its neighbouring islands. She also was to participate in the coming expedition, and having still a good many months free, had decided to go from Warsaw to Andijan to visit her sister, who was married to a representative of the textile firm Poznansky, and to take a rest there before the date of our assembling at Chadzu. On the way, we talked a great deal, and among other things, I told her about my recent enterprises. I do not remember how or for what reason a dispute arose between us, but the result was that it ended in a wager according to which, under very precise conditions, and by a definite date, I was to make a certain sum of money. This wager interested Vedvitskia so seriously that not only that she not only decided to stay with me to see how I would fulfill it, but even undertook to help me. So instead of going on to Andijan, she got off the train with me at Ashgabat. I must admit that the fulfillment of this accidentally arisen and complicated task, which I had taken upon myself, interested me so much that I was fired with a passionate obstinacy to carry out whatever the consequences and even to surpass the set conditions. While still in the train, I thought out a general plan of action, and as a first step, I then and there drew up the following advertisement. The Universal Travelling Workshop in its passage will stop here for a very short time. Hurry and give your orders and bring everything you have to be prepared or remodelled. We repair sewing machines, typewriters, bicycles, gramophones, music boxes, electric, photographic, medical and other apparatus, gas and oil lamps, clocks, all kinds of musical instruments, accordions, guitars, violins, taris and so on. We repair locks and weapons of all sorts. We repair, remodel, upholster and refinish any piece of furniture whatever, either in our workshop or at your own house. We repair, varnish and tune upright and grand pianos and harmoniums. We install and repair electric lighting, bells and telephones. We mend and recover umbrellas. We repair children's toys and dolls and rubber articles of all kinds. We wash, clean and mend rugs, shawls, tapestries, furs, etc. We remove all kinds of stains. We restore pictures, porcelain and all kinds of antiques. The work has a well-equipped galvoplastic cabinet for gold painting, silver painting, for gold plating, silver plating, nickel plating, bronze thing you wish on wood, leather and cloth. The workshop takes orders for all kinds of alabaster and plaster models, such as statuettes, domestic and wild animals, fruits, etc., etc., and also makes plaster masks of the dead. We execute orders for the artificial flowers in bread, wax, velvet and coloured paper, for wreaths, bouquets, ladies' hats and usher buttonholes. We write by hand, print and decorate visiting cards, greeting and anniversary cards and invitations. We take orders for corsets and trussets and also make new ones into old ones into new. We make ladies' hats from the latest Paris models, etc., etc. As soon as we arrived in Ashgabat, I found lodgings and obtained permission from the police to print and distribute the advertisements. The next day I rented in the centre of the town premises for the workshop, consisting of a large room opening onto the street for the shop and two small rooms at the back. In addition, there was a small yard and a kind of shed. Having bought the most necessary tools and hastily set up a homemade Bunsen battery, and adapted some old wash basins as vats for galvanoplastic work, I hung over the entrance a large sign with red letters on a white cloth which said, American Travelling Workshop, here for a very short time, makes, alters and repairs everything. The next day, when the advertisements were ready, I passed a great many of them on the walls with the help of a street urchin and distributed the rest by hand. And then the fun began. From the very first day, a whole procession of Ashgabadians brought their things to be repaired. Lord, what on earth did they not bring? Most of what they brought I not only had never seen before, but had never even heard of. Indeed, they were the most unlikely things, such as an apparatus for plucking out grey hairs, a machine for stoning cherries for jam, a grinder for grinding copper sulphate to sprinkle on the sweat zones of the body, a special iron for ironing wigs, and so forth. In order to have a better picture of what went on there, you must be told, if only a little, about the local conditions. This part of the Transcaspian region and part of Turkestan adjoining it had begun to be populated by foreigners, and only a few decades previously, and the new towns had grown up mostly on the outskirts of the old ones. Consequently, almost all the towns of this region were composed of two parts, the old, as it was called, Asiatic town, and alongside it the new, Russian town, each living its own independent life. The population of these new towns consisted of Armenians, Jews, Georgians, Persians and others, but chiefly of Russians, most of whom were public officials or retired soldiers who had finished their terms of service in this region. Thanks to the natural riches of the country and the honesty of a local population as yet unspoiled by contemporary civilization, these newcomers quickly began to grow rich, but in the absence of any cultural influences on the part of the ignorant officials who had happened to become their governors, they remained just as uncultivated as they had been before they migrated there. And so, along with a flourishing commerce which had brought them material wealth, there was nothing to develop any aspect of their intellectuality or their technical knowledge. European civilization, which was repeatedly spreading everywhere else, had scarcely touched the people of these places, and the little they learned about it, through newspapers and magazines, reached them in a completely distorted form, owing to the fantastic exaggerations of journalists, who in general, and particularly then in Russia, were quite incapable of even an approximate understanding of the real essence of what they were writing about. These newly rich people, according to the inherency of all upstarts, imitated everything cultured and fashionable, in the given case everything European. But drawing all their information about this culture and fashion only from Russian papers and magazines compiled by persons themselves ignorant in these matters, they presented to an impartial observer a comical and at the same time sad caricature. And so in great material prosperity, but without a single trace of even elementary culture, the inhabitants there were playing as children do at being civilized people. Nowhere was fashion more closely followed, everyone feeling obliged to be up to date in everything. Moreover, they eagerly bought or ordered by post from everywhere all sorts of new inventions and everything considered appropriate to the life of the cultured gentleman. Though, of course, only what they could find out about this from newspaper advertisements. Knowing this weakness of theirs, all the foreign tradesmen, especially the Germans, unloaded a mass of useless merchandise on them, or goods which quickly got spoiled or worn out. The comedy went so far you could even find among the objects advertised a special machine for lighting ordinary matches. As most of the articles they sent for were either worthless to begin with, or went to pieces almost at once, and there was not a single repair shop in the locality, each family accumulated stacks of broken things. There was still another reason why there turned out to be so many things for repair. At that epoch in the East, and particularly in Asiatic Russia, it was the custom never to part with anything once acquired, and never to sell it, even if it were no longer needed or has fallen apart. Moreover, even if one had wished to sell, there would have been no one to buy. And besides this, the practice was firmly entrenched of keeping things in remembrance of something, or of someone. So, in every house, the attics and sheds were filled with an amazing accumulation of useless things, which were even handed down from father to son. Consequently, when they learned that there was a workshop that repaired everything, they were dragged to me devil knows what, in the hope of restoring and making use of things that had long lain useless, as, for example, grandfather's armchair, and grandmother's spectacles, great-grandfather's balalaika, great-grandmother's watch, godfather's gift of a dressing case, the blanket under which the bishop slept when he had stayed with them, an order of the star presented to father by the Shah of Persia, and so forth and so on. All these I repaired. Not once did I refuse anything or return it without repairing it. Even when I was offered too trifling a payment to justify the time spent on repairing some article or other, I nevertheless undertook to put it right if the thing was new to me, since in that case I was interested not in the money itself, but in the difficulty presented by a kind of work that was as yet unfamiliar to me. In addition to spoiled and really useless things, they brought me quantities of brand new things, not damaged at all, which they were unable to use merely because they did not know how to make them work, owing to their ignorance and lack of any even elementary technical knowledge. In short, owing to their stupidity. At that time, the latest inventions, such as sewing machines, bicycles, typewriters, etc., were spreading everywhere at a furious rate. All these things were enthusiastically ordered and bought, but then, owing, as I have already said, to the lack of even the simplest technical knowledge, and in the absence of local workshops or specialists, as soon as the slightest thing went wrong with them, they were set aside as useless. I shall give you a few characteristic examples of this ignorance and naivete, which I admit I then made use of quite deliberately, without experiencing any remorse of conscience whatsoever. I remember how one day a rich, fat Armenian, puffing, bathed in perspiration, accompanied by his daughter, dragging a sewing machine to be repaired, which he had bought for her trousseau while he was staying in Nizhny Novgorod for the fair. At first, this sewing machine was, as he said, a treasure. It simply could not be praised too highly. It sewed so cleanly and so quickly. But all of a sudden, for no rhyme or reason, and much to his vexation, it started going, as he expressed it, in reverse. Looking over the machine, I found it in perfectly good order. You may know that in certain sewing machines, alongside the lever regulating the seam, there is another lever for changing the direction of the feeder. And when this lever is shifted, one changes the direction in which the material moves. Obviously, someone had touched this lever unawares, and instead of the material being pushed forward, it was now being pulled backwards. I saw at once that to put the machine right, I had only to shift the lever into place, and I could have done this then and there. But seeing that I was dealing with a crafty old rogue, and learning from the conversation that he was a merchant of Kharkul skins, I felt sure, well knowing such types, that to cram his own pockets he had tricked more than one Teki or Bukharian, who are as credulous as children, and I therefore decided to pay him back in his own coin. So I went into a long-winded story about what was wrong with his sewing machine, and I told him that several pinions would have to be changed for the machine to work properly again, at the same time cursing by everything under the sun the rascally manufacturers of the day. In short, I skinned him for 12 rubles, 50 kopecks, promising to put the machine right in 3 days. But of course, he had scarcely reached the door when it was already put right, numbered, and placed with the finished articles. I remember well how on another occasion an officer entered the workshop and said to me with a tone of great importance, "Go to the office of the regional commandant and tell the clerk in charge that I order him." By the way, Russian officers of that period never spoke to anyone except to give orders. "To show you the typewriters. When you have looked at them, let me know what is wrong with them." And off he went, as he had come. His offhand, imperious tone astonished me and somehow infuriated me. So I decided to go there without fail, chiefly in order to find out what sort of a bird this officer was, and perhaps also to find a way of putting one over on him, which I must admit I always enjoyed doing, because beneath an expression of naive innocence, I knew how to punish such insolent persons very venomously. I went the same day to that office, announced myself to the head clerk, and explained the reason of my visit. I discovered that it was the adjutant himself who had come to see me. While I was examining the typewriters, of which there were 3, the loquacious clerk whom I had already made my friend thanks to a cigarette and a piquant anecdote of the officer life, explained to me the following. These machines, recently received from St. Petersburg, at first worked excellently, but soon one, then another, and then the third got out of order. All in the same way. The ribbon stopped unwinding. The adjutant, the quartermaster, and others all tried to put them in order, but try as they might, no one succeeded, and for the last 3 days the office work had again to be written by hand. While the clerk was telling me all this, I had examined the typewriters and already knew what the trouble was. Some of you doubtless remember that formerly, in certain makes of typewriters, the ribbon spools were unwound by the pressure of a spring placed in a special box in the lower part of the back of the machine, and were wound up by turning the box itself. As the ribbon moved slowly, the spring, being of considerable length, took quite a long time to run down, but from time to time had to be wound up again. It was obvious that when the machines were delivered, their springs had been fully wound up, and that, having run down in the course of time, they had only to be wound up again. But there was no key or handle. It was difficult for people who had been given no instructions and lacked even the simplest technical notions to discover how to rewind the spools. Of course, I did not say anything of this to the clerks, but accepted their invitation to dine with them, and having eaten some good government cabbage soup and kasha, I went straight home on my antediluvian bicycle and what remained of its tyres. Pause just there. Isn't it really interesting that he uses this term for more than one thing, an antediluvian bicycle? That evening the adjutant came back to my workshop and in the same lofty tone asked, "Well, how about it? Have you found out yet why these brand new typewriters won't work?" Long before this, I had already become an old hand in the art of playing a role. So, assuming the expression called by real actors, respectful timidity and bashful deference, and employing special and pompous terms borrowed from various Russian technical works, I began to extol the perfections of this make of the typewriter in every respect but one, in which unfortunately a change, though complicated and difficult to bring about, was absolutely necessary. As for the work to be done, I estimated that the charge would be almost a quarter of the cost of the machines of it themselves. The next day these perfectly good machines were solemnly brought to my workshop by a whole detachment of soldiers, headed by the adjutant. I accepted them immediately and then announced in a very serious matter that in no case could the machines be ready in less than 10 days. The vexed adjutant begged me to finish them sooner if possible, as the work in the office was almost at a standstill. Finally, after much bargaining, I agreed to work at night and to deliver one machine in 2 days, but in return I begged him to be good enough to order his soldiers to bring the leavings of food from the mess for my 3 suckling pigs, which I had just bought and was keeping in my little yard. 2 days later, one of these quite faultless machines was ready, and I promised the others for the end of the week. Besides the thanks and the 18 rubles I received for repairing each machine, the soldiers brought food daily to my suckling pigs and took care of them themselves for the 3 months that I remained in Ashgabat, during which time my suckling pigs turned into full-grown porkers. Of course, I explained to the clerks what had to be done when the springs ran down, but what my repairing had consisted of, they apparently never understood. The same kind of thing was repeated many times in the town of Merv, where I transferred my workshop and went on with the same sort of work for 2 or more months. One day, the inspector of the local preparatory school there, I do not remember the name of the school, came to ask me to repair an electric machine for making experiments in physics. This was an ordinary electrostatic machine, which, on the turning of the discs, emits sparks, and which, for some reason or other, every school then, and it seems almost even now, considered it its duty to possess. With this machine, in their famous so-called physics lessons, the teachers would pompously, and though performing a sacred ritual, make instructive experiments, which consisted merely in turning the discs of the machine and compelling the children one by one to touch the little metal knobs of the Leyden bars. The grimaces of pain appearing on the faces of the children on touching these knobs always provoked uproarious laughter, which these pedagogues considered as greatly assisting the digestion of food. And this was the usual finale of such a physics lesson. This inspector had ordered one of these machines and had received it unassembled from German firm of Siemens and Halsk in St. Petersburg. Although he and the other teachers, his colleagues, had assembled it according to the instructions, try as they might, they could not obtain any sparks from it, and finally the inspector was compelled to apply to my workshop. I at once saw that everything was in good order except that the two discs composing of the principal part of the machine were not quite correctly placed in relation to each other. It was simply necessary to loosen the nut on the axle and slightly shift one of the discs, and this I could have done in a minute. But I obliged this esteemed pedagogue, who taught others what he himself did not know, to come back to the workshop 4 times while I was, as it were, repairing his machine, and to pay me 10 rubles, 75 kopecks, for supposedly charging the Leyden's jars, which needed no charging. Such cases were of almost daily occurrence throughout the existence of this workshop of mine. Always meeting the poor halfway, I did not consider it a sin to profit by the stupidity of those who undeservedly, only by virtue of positions acquired by chance, had become the local intelligentsia, but who, on the scale of real intelligence, actually understood much lower than the general population under their authority. Pause. Oh, look at that. 120 years ago, life was exactly the same as it is right now. A bunch of fucking idiots who don't deserve the positions that they're in nor the money that they receive, running around thinking that they are a cut above the rest, when in actual fact they are some of the thickest, just the stupidest morons that you could ever possibly meet in your life. Nothing's changed in 120 years. Wow. What a surprise. But the most original and at the same time the most profitable affair turned out to be the corset business. That season in Paris, the fashion in corsets was sharply changed. After having worn very high corsets, fashionable women suddenly began to wear quite low ones. Well, this is when they all started sexualizing themselves, is it? Getting their titties out. This new caprice of fashion soon became known in this region through the fashion magazines, but the corsets themselves were not yet on sale there, owing to the remoteness of these places. Consequently, many women began to bring me their old corsets to see if it was possible somehow to make them into fashionable ones. On account of this corset business, I found myself on Easy Street. This happened in the following way. Once I needed some whalebone for a certain stout Jewess's corset, which I had to shorten, and incidentally widen owing to the progressively increasing waistline of the owner. After a long and fruitless search, the assistant in a shop which, like so many others, did not have whalebone in stock, advised me to buy a whole out-of-date corset, since doubtless the proprietor would sell it at almost the price of the whalebone. And then I went directly to the proprietor. But while I was bargaining with him, another plan ripened in my mind, and I bought from him not one corset, as I had intended, but all that he had in his shop. 75 old-fashioned corsets at 20 kopecks apiece. instead of the usual price of 4 or 5 rubles. After which I hurried off to buy up corsets in all the other shops of Ashgabat, paying even lower prices because everyone was glad to get rid of their stock of these quite useless articles. I did not stop at this, but the next day sent off the father of the 2 boys I employed, an old Jew, with instructions to buy up old-fashioned corsets in all the towns along the Central Asiatic Railway, while I, myself, with pliers and scissors, set about making fashionable corsets. This was done very simply. The line where the corset had to be cut was traced in pencil, more having to be cut from the top and only a little from the lower part. Then along this line, the ends of the whalebone were broken off with pliers and the material cut with scissors. The girls who worked with me under the direction of Vivitskia ripped off the tapes binding the borders, cut them and sewed them on again around the shortened corset. All that remained to be done was to thread through half of the old laces, and a mignon corset of the latest Paris fashion was ready for sale. And as many as 100 were made in a day. The most comical result was that the shop owners, having learned of the metamorphosis of their old corsets, were obliged, in the view of great demand for them, to buy them back from me, with, as is said, gnashing of teeth, but now not for 10 or 20 kopecks, but at the price of 3.5 rubles a corset. In order to give you an idea of the outcome of all this, I need only to say that I bought up and sold in the towns of Krasnovodsk, Kizilurvat, Ashgabat, Merv, Chadru, Bukhara, Samarkand and Tashkent more than 6,000 corsets. A material profit out of all proportion to the scale of the enterprise was achieved not merely owing to the ignorance and naivete of the local, so to say, variegated inhabitants, or even to my well-developed astuteness and resourceful adaptability to all kinds of situations, but chiefly owing to my merciless attitude towards those weaknesses, present in me as in everyone, which, through repetition, form in man what is called laziness. It is interesting to note that during that period, a change in the functioning of my common presence took place. Inexplicable from the standpoint of ordinary science, and repeated more than once in the course of my life. This was a change in the regulation of the tempo of the incoming and outgoing of energy, which enabled me to sleep scarcely at all for several weeks, and even for months. Yet, at the same time, to manifest an activity which, far from being reduced, was on the contrary even more intense than usual. The last time this state reappeared, I was so interested in this phenomena that it became for me, that is, for my self-cognizing parts, a question of equal significance to that of certain other questions which had arisen in me long before, and the solution of which had, from then on, been the aim and sense of my life. I even intend, after arranging matters connected with the fundamental program of the Institute, and when I shall again have the possibility of devoting half my time to my subjective interests, to give first place to the elucidation of this question. This as yet incomprehensible particularity of the general functioning of my organism may be seen very clearly in the situation which existed during the period I am describing. All day long, an almost constant stream of customers, outdoing one another on loquacity, bought me their broken things for repair or came to pick up those already repaired, so that the greater part of my day was spent in receiving and returning orders. The intervals when there happened to be no customers gave me barely enough time, even when I made exceptional haste, for going to buy new parts and the many and varied materials constantly required. Thus the work itself had to be done at night. During the entire period of existence of the workshop, I had to divide my time in this way. The day for customers and the whole night for working. I must say that I was greatly helped in all this work by Wittwitskia, who very soon became almost an expert at covering umbrellas and remodeling corsets and ladies' hats, and especially at making artificial flowers. I was also helped by the 2 boys I had taken on at the very beginning, the sons of the old Jew. The elder cleaned and prepared the metal things for galvanizing and polished them afterwards, and the younger ran errands and kindled the fire in the forge and kept the bellows going. Towards the end, I was also helped, and by no means badly, by 6 young girls from local patriarchal families, whose parents, desiring them to have a complete education, sent them to my universal workshop to perfect themselves in fine needlework. Even at the beginning, there were only 4 of us. Even at the beginning, when there were only 4 of us, the quantity of work done was indeed such that it gave the impression that behind the door leading to the back rooms, on which of course there was a notice, "Entrance strictly forbidden to the public," at least several dozen expert craftsmen were working. The workshop was open in Ashgabat 3.5 months, and during that time I had made 50,000 rubles. Do you know what such a sum then meant? For comparison, one must remember that at the time the salary of the average Russian public official was 33 rubles, 33 kopecks a month. And that with this sum, not only a single man, but one who had a family and even a crowd of children contrived to live. The salary of a high-ranking officer, from 45 to 50 rubles, was considered a great deal of money, and the dream of every young man was to earn this much. Meat then cost 6 kopecks a pound, bread 2 or 3 kopecks, good grapes 2 kopecks, and there were 100 kopecks in a ruble. 50,000 rubles. That was considered a real fortune. During the existence of the workshop, there were frequent opportunities for making greater profits by going into enterprises on the side. But one of the conditions of the wager was that the money had to be earned only by manual skills and by such small commercial transactions as would necessarily be connected with them. So I did not once yield to this temptation. The wager had long been won while still in Ashgabat, and the agreed amount earned 4 times over. Nevertheless, as I have said, I decided to go on with the same sort of work in another town. Almost everything had been liquidated. Wittwitskia had gone to her sister's, and I was ready to leave 3 days later for Merv. What I have already told you is, I think, sufficient for you to have some idea of what I wish to make clear by this story, namely, that a specific feature of the common psyche of man, which is an ideal for you Americans, and which you call the commercial fibre, may also exist, and be even more highly developed, along with the other fibres which you Americans do not have, among people living on other continents. Nevertheless, to illustrate this further, and to give a fuller picture of my activities in those days, I will tell you about one more commercial trick which I played just before I left Ashgabat. I must tell you that just after I opened my workshop, I announced that I would buy all sorts of things. I did so for 2 reasons. Firstly, I counted on finding parts needed for my repairs, as I had soon brought up in the shops and bazaars everything that could be of use to me for this purpose. And secondly, because I hoped that among the old things brought in or offered for inspection at home, I might, as often happens, chance upon something rare and valuable. In a word, I was also an antique dealer. A few days before my departure, I met at the bazaar a Georgian woman who I had known before near Tiflis, who had run the buffet at one of the stations of the Transcaucasian Railway. It was now a contractor for army provisions, and he offered to sell me several old iron beds, of which he had a surplus. I went to his house, and that same evening we went down into the cellar to look at the beds. But there was such an intolerable stench that it was almost impossible to stay there. Hastily examining the beds, I fled as quickly as possible and began negotiations only after we had reached the street. I learned then that the stench in the cellar came from herrings that were stored there, 20 barrels of them, which he had bought from Astrakhan for the local officers' mess. When the first 2 barrels were delivered and opened, the herrings were found to have gone bad and were rejected. The Georgian, fearing to lose his reputation, did not wish to offer them anywhere else. So he took them back and placed them temporarily in his cellar, then almost forgot about them. It was only now, after 3 months, when his whole house reeked of them, that he had made up his mind to get rid of them as soon as possible. What vexed him was not only that he had lost money on them, but that in addition he would have to pay to have them carted to the dump heap, as otherwise the Sanitary Commission might hear about it and fine him. While he was telling me all this, my thoughts began to work, according to the habit formed in me during this period, and I asked myself whether it might not be possible, by some combination of other, to derive profit even from this affair. I began to calculate. He has 20 barrels of rotten herrings which must be thrown away, but the barrels themselves are worth at least a rouble apiece. If only I could get them emptied for nothing. Otherwise, carting them away would cost almost as much as they were worth. And suddenly it dawned on me that surely herrings, especially rotten ones, would make good manure. And I thought that a gardener, in order to get such good manure for nothing, would surely agree in return to fetch the barrels, empty them, rinse them out, and bring them to me at the workshop. After smoking them, I would be able to sell them at once, as barrels were in great demand, and in this way, in half an hour I should make 20 roubles, and nobody would lose anything, but on the contrary, everybody would gain by this, even the Georgian who had lost on the merchandise, but would now at least save the expense of carting. Having thus thought things out, I said to the Georgian, "If you will take a little more off the beds, I will arrange for these barrels to be carted away without any cost to you." He agreed, and I promised to rid him of this source of infection the next morning. I paid for the beds, loaded them on my cart, and also took along one of the unopened barrels of herrings to show to a gardener. Back at the workshop, we unloaded and put everything into a shed. Just at that time, the old Jew, the father of the boys who was working for me, came in, as he usually did in the evenings, to have a chat with his sons, and even sometimes to help them with their work. I sat down in my little yard to smoke, and the thought suddenly entered my head to try the herrings on my pigs. Perhaps they might eat them. Without explaining anything to the old man, I asked him to help me open the barrel. When the lid was raised, the old Jew bent over to inhale the odour, and immediately his face lit up and he exclaimed, "Now that's what I call herrings! Oh, herrings like these I have not seen for a long time, indeed, not since I got into this damned country." I was puzzled. Having lived mostly in Asia where they do not eat herrings, I could not tell good from bad, even if I happened to eat them. They all had the same nasty smell for me, so I was bound to give some credence to this emphatic announcement of the old Jew, the more so since formerly, when he lived in Russia in the town of Rostov, he had a butcher's shop where he also used to sell fish. However, I was still not entirely convinced, and asked him whether he might not be mistaken, but he, offended to the core, replied, "What's that you're saying? These are genuine, preserved, such and such herrings." I do not remember what he called them. Still having some doubts, I told him that I had by chance brought up a whole consignment of these herrings, and that amongst us it was a good omen when any goods were opened if some were sold at once. It was a sign that the entire sale would be successful. So now we should at once, without waiting till morning, sell at least a few herrings, and I asked him to try to do this immediately. In this way, I wanted to make sure that what the old man had said was true, and to act accordingly. Near my workshop lived many Jews, most of them tradespeople. As it was evening, most of the shops were closed. But just opposite the workshop lived a watchmaker, a certain Friedman. He was called on first, and he instantly bought a whole dozen, paying, without any bargaining, 15 kopecks a pair. The next buyer was the proprietor of a pharmacy on the corner, who at once bought 50. From the delighted tones of these buyers, I knew that the old man was right. The next morning at daybreak, I hired carts and brought over to my place all the barrels except the 2 already opened, which were really quite spoiled, and from which had come that terrible stench. Thus, these I immediately sent off to the town dump. The remaining 18 barrels of herrings turned out to be not only good, but of the very best quality. Evidently, neither the buyer for the officer's mess nor the Georgian merchant, a native of Tiflis, where they do not eat herrings, knew any more about them than I did. That is, nothing at all, and from their peculiar smell they had considered them spoiled, and the Georgian had resigned himself to his loss. In 3 days, with the help of the old Jew, to whom I paid half a kopeck per herring, which made him extremely happy, all the herrings were sold, wholesale and retail. By this time I had liquidated all my affairs, and on the eve of my departure I invited that Georgian, along with many other acquaintances, to a farewell supper. At table I related how well this affair had turned out for me, and pulling the money out of my pocket I offered to share my profits with him. But the Georgian, holding to a commercial principle firmly established among the old inhabitants of Transcaucasia and the Transcaspian region, refused to accept the money. He said that, when he had let me have the goods, he was certain that they were quite worthless, and if it had proved otherwise, it was a stroke of good luck for me and of bad luck for him, and therefore he considered it unfair to take advantage of my kindness. Moreover, the next day, when I left for Merv, I found among my things in the carriage a goat skin of wine from this Georgian. After the episode of this peculiar workshop of mine, several years passed, in which, while working unceasingly to prepare all the conditions necessary for the accomplishment of the fundamental aim of my life, I had to occupy myself quite often with all kinds of money-making affairs. Although these many adventures and unexpected happenings of these years might be of great interest to you from both the psychological and the practical points of view, yet, not wishing to digress from the question raised this evening, I will not speak of them now. The more so I intend to write an entire book about these years and similar periods of my life. I will only say that by the time I set myself the task of creating a definite amount of capital, I had already acquired much experience and self-confidence, and therefore, when I directed all my faculties towards making money for this purpose, then, even though this aspect of human striving in itself had never been of interest to me, I carried it out in such a way that the results might have aroused the envy of even your best American dollar business experts. I engaged in the most varied enterprises, sometimes very big ones. For instance, I carried out private and government contracts for the supply and construction of railways and roads. I opened a number of stores, restaurants and cinemas, and sold them when I got them going well. I organized various rural activities and the driving of cattle into Russia from several countries, chiefly from Kashgar. I participated in oil wells and fisheries, and sometimes I carried on several of these enterprises simultaneously. But the business I preferred above all others, which never required my specially devoting to it any definite time, or needed any fixed place of residence, and which moreover was very profitable, was the trade in carpets and antiques of all kinds. Finally, after 4 or 5 years of, so to say, feverish activity, I liquidated all my affairs, and when, near the end of 1913, I went to Moscow to begin to actualize in practice what I had taken upon myself as a sacred task, I had amassed the sum of 1,000,000 rubles, and had acquired in addition 2 invaluable collections, one of old and rare carpets, and the other of porcelain and what is called Chinese cloisonné. Apologies. It seemed then that with such a capital I would not have to think any more about financial matters, and would be free to put into practice the ideas which had already taken definite form in my consciousness, and upon which my institute would be based. Namely, I wished to create around myself conditions in which a man would be continually reminded of the sense and aim of his existence by an unavoidable friction between his conscience and the automatic manifestations of his nature. That was about a year before the World War. In Moscow, and a little later in St. Petersburg, I arranged a series of lectures which attracted a number of intellectuals and men of science, and the circle of people interested in my ideas soon began to grow. Following my general plan, I then took steps towards the creation of my institute. Little by little, I began to prepare everything required for the accomplishment of my project. Among other things, I purchased an estate, ordered from different European countries what could not be obtained in Russia, and bought instruments and other necessary equipment. I even began to arrange for the publication of my own newspaper. In the thick of this work of organisation, a war broke out. The war broke out, and I had to suspend everything, though in the hope of resuming as soon as possible. In the hope of resuming as soon as the political situation became more settled. By this time, half of the capital I had collected had already been spent on the preparatory organisation. The war continued to gain ground, and, as hope of an early peace grew fainter and fainter, I was compelled to leave Moscow and go to the Caucasus to await the end of hostilities. In spite of the fact that political events filled everyone's mind, interest in my work continued to grow in certain circles of society. People really interested in my ideas began to collect at Essentuki, where I was then settled. They came not only from the immediate neighbourhood, but from St. Petersburg and Moscow. And little by little, circumstances obliged me to form an organisation there without waiting for the return to Moscow. But here too, events took such a turn that it became a problem not only to work but even to survive, no one ever knowing what the morrow would bring. The district of the mineral waters where we were living became a centre of civil war, and we found ourselves literally between 2 fires. Towns passed from hand to hand, one day to the Bolsheviks, the next day to the Cossacks, and the day after to the White Army or to some newly formed party. Sometimes, on getting up in the morning, we would not know under which government we were that day, and only on going out into the street would discover what politics had to be professed. All the time, I not only had to think about and worry about obtaining the most immediate necessities of life, which had become almost unprocurable, but I was constantly concerned about the lives of the 100 or so people who were in my care. What made me most anxious was the situation of about 20 of my pupils, as they began to call themselves, who were of military age. Young and even middle-aged men were being conscripted every day, one day by the Bolsheviks, the next day by the Whites, and the day after by some other faction. This constant tension could not be endured any longer. Cost what it might, some way out had to be found. One night, when there was more shooting than usual, and the echoes of anxious conversations of my companions reached me from the adjoining rooms, I began to reflect very seriously. While I was considering ways out of the impasse, I remembered by association one of the sayings of the wise Mullah Nasruddin, which long before this had become for me a sort of fixed idea, namely, in every circumstance of life, always strive to combine the useful with the agreeable. I should mention here that for many years I've been interested in an archaeological question, and in order to clarify certain details, I needed to find out as much as possible about the situation and pattern of arrangement of those monuments called dolmens, which have survived from very ancient times and can be found in our day in certain specific locations on almost every continent. Pause. He talks about the dolmens in W.J. Perry talks about the dolmens in his book, The Children of the Sun. They are signs of the archaic civilization. I had definite information that such dolmens were to be found in many places in the Caucasus, and even knew the approximate location of some of them as indicated by official science. Although I never had enough time for a systematic exploration of these places, nevertheless, during my frequent trips through the mountains of the Caucasus and Transcaucasia, I had never missed an opportunity for going to see them, choosing for this the times least detrimental to the pursuit of my fundamental aim. As a result of what I had already discovered myself, it had become quite clear to me that in the regions between the eastern shores of the Black Sea and the chain of the Caucasus Mountains, especially in the neighbourhood of certain passes I had not yet been over, dolmens were to be found, standing singly and almost in little groups, of a particular type which would be of great interest to me. So, as I found myself cut off from the world, with my activities brought to a standstill by the situation which had arisen, I decided to use the time at my disposal for a special expedition to those regions of the Caucasus, in order to search for and examine these dolmens, and at the same time bring both myself and the people in my care into safety. The next morning I marshalled my resources, and with the help of several persons who were more or less half-consciously or unconsciously devoted to me, and who had a kind of relationship with the various power possessors of that moment, I set about trying to procure official permission for organising a scientific expedition into the Caucasus Mountains. Having succeeded in getting this permission, I obtained, by all sorts of devices, everything necessary for a journey of this kind. I then chose a number of my pupils, chiefly those for whom it was most dangerous to stay in the district of the mineral waters. After I had provided for the others remaining behind, we set off in two parties, which were to meet at an agreed place. The first party of this scientific expedition, which started from the town of Pyatigorsk, consisted of 12 persons, and the second, from the town of Essentuki, of 21, of whom I was one. Officially, these two groups were considered quite independent of each other and having nothing in common. Without really knowing the conditions then prevailing in this country, one might have a particularly fertile imagination to form even a rough idea of what it meant to organise a scientific expedition, moreover an official one, at such a time. From Essentuki I intended to go first through inhabited districts to Mount Indur, situated not far from Tuapse, and from there to begin searching in a southeasterly direction along a line from 25 to 60 miles distant from the shores of the Black Sea. For the first part of the journey I managed, after great difficulties, to procure from the Bolshevik government, which was then in power, 2 railway wagons. And this I did at a time when, owing to constant movement of troops, it was almost unthinkable even for one man without luggage to travel by rail. Having squeezed into these wagons all 21 persons, 2 horses, 2 mules, and 3 two-wheel carts, not to mention the great quantity of equipment bought for the expedition, such as tents, provisions, and various instruments and weapons, we started off. We travelled this way as far as Maikop, but since the whole roadbed of the railway beyond this town had been destroyed the previous day by a newly formed group of rebels who called themselves by some such title as the Greens, our expedition was compelled to continue further on foot and by cart, and not in the direction of Tuaps, which I had originally intended, but towards what is known as White River Pass. In order to reach uninhabited territory, we had to pass through populated districts and cross the Bolshevik and White Army lines no fewer than 5 times. When I recall all those almost indescribable difficulties, even now that it is all over and only a memory of the past, there arises in me a feeling of satisfaction that I succeeded in surmounting them. It was indeed as if, during that whole period, miracles were being performed for us. The epidemic of fanaticism and mutual hatred, which had seized all the people around us, did not touch us at all. One might have said that I and my companions moved under supernatural protection. Just as our attitude towards each side was impartial, as if we were not of this world, so their attitude towards us was the same. They considered us completely neutral, as in truth we were. Surrounded by infuriated beasts of peoples, ready to tear one another apart for the slightest booty, I moved amid this chaos quite openly and fiercely, without concealing anything or resorting to any subterfuge. And in spite of the fact that requisitionary pillaging was in full swing, nothing was taken from us, not even the 2 casks of alcohol, which, on account of great scarcity, were the envy of all. I'm telling you about this now, a feeling of justice, that very justice which comes from my understanding of the psyche of people subjected to such events, obliges me to pay a tribute to those of the Bolsheviks and White Army volunteers, most of them no longer alive, whose attitude of goodwill towards my activities, even though adopted unconsciously and purely instinctively, assisted the fortunate outcome of this dangerous enterprise of mine. Indeed, if I did manage to get safely out of that hell, in the full sense of the word, it was not due entirely to my well-developed ability to discern and play upon the slightest changes in the weaknesses of the psyche of the people in a psychosis of this kind. In the conditions in which these events were taking place, I would not have been able, even by maintaining the most active vigilance day and night, to foresee all the unexpected things that happened and to take corresponding measures. In my opinion, we got out safely because of the common presences of these people. Although in the grip of a psychic state in which the last grain of reasonableness vanishes, the instinct inherent in all human beings for distinguishing good from evil, in the objective sense, was not completely lacking. And therefore, instinctively sensing my activities and the living germ of that sacred impulse which alone is capable of bringing genuine happiness to humanity, they furthered in what way they could the process of accomplishment of that which I had undertaken long before this war. In all our dealings with them, there was never once a situation, either with the Bolsheviks or the White Army volunteers, for which I could not find some way out. Here I will add, by the way, that if at some time in the future if there should then be specialists for investigating events similar to those which occurred in Russia, the various documents I have kept, which were issued to me by the 2 opposing sides for the protection of my interests and possessions, would furnish very instructive evidence for the extraordinary incidents that can occur during such mass psychosis. For example, among these numerous documents there is one paper on the side of which is written, "The bearer, Citizen Gurdjieff, has the right to carry everywhere a revolver, caliber number, certified by signature and seal affixed. The President of the Soldiers' Secretary and workmen's deputies. Shandarovsky Rohides. Place of issue, Essentuki, the date of issue, blah blah blah. On the back of this paper is written, a certain Gurdjieff is authorized to carry a revolver, numbered as indicated on the reverse side. Certified by signature and seal affixed by General Denikin, General Heyman, Chief of Staff, General Davidovich Nashinsky. Issued in Maikop. After tremendous efforts surmounting numerous unexpected obstacles, we went through devastated Cossack villages and finally got to Kamichki, the last inhabited place before the wilderness of the Caucasus Mountains. Beyond this point there were no passable roads. In Kamichki we had made haste to procure whatever provisions were still obtainable, abandoned our carts to their fate, loading most of our things on the horses and mules, and carrying the rest ourselves, began to climb up the everlasting mountains. Only after crossing the first pass did we at last breathe freely, feeling that the greatest dangers were behind us. But it was just here that the real difficulties of the journey began. About this part of the expedition from Kamichki, over the White River Pass to Sochi, across the wilds of the Caucasian Range, a journey which lasted about 2 months, filled with strange and even extraordinary adventures, I will not say anything. And this is because, according to the information which has reached me, a description of this escape of ours from the centre of hell to its edge, through the most impassable wilds of these mountains, as well as of our successful investigation of dolmens, and of all the visible and hidden riches of this region, has already been written, and will doubtless soon be published by certain members of this singular scientific expedition, who subsequently returned to Russia and are now cut off from the rest of the world. The group of people round me on this journey happened quite unexpectedly to be of such diverse types and education that could not have been more suitable for the aims of our expedition, and they very effectively helped me to resolve the problem of the dolmens. Among them were very good technicians and specialists in various branches of science, mining and other engineers, as well as specialists in archaeology, astronomy, zoology, medicine and other fields of knowledge. I will only add that, of all my impressions during this journey, the most outstanding is of the beauty of the region between Kamichki and Sochi, especially of those from the pass down to the sea, which indeed deserve the high-sounding name of terrestrial paradise, often attributed to other parts of the Caucasus by so-called intelligentsia. Although these regions would be quite suitable for agriculture as well as for watering places, and are not very far from populated centres, yet, in spite of the growing need for land of this sort, they remain, for some reason or other, uninhabited and undeveloped. They were formerly populated by Cherkesses, who migrated to Turkey 40 or 50 years ago. Since then they have been abandoned, and no man's foot has trod them. On our way, we sometimes came across formerly well-cultivated lands and excellent orchards, which, although overgrown and wild, were still yielding enough fruit to feed thousands. Well then, only at the end of about 2 months, worn out with this fatigue and with our provisions almost gone, did we succeed in reaching the town of Sochi, on the shores of the Black Sea. Here, because certain members of the expedition, during what might be called our Way of Golgotha, were not equal to the situation, but manifested properties not corresponding at all to the high aim we held in view, I decided to part with them and went on with the others. We travelled now by ordinary roads to the town of Tiflis, where there was still, for that tumultuous time, a relative degree of order under which the rule of the Menshevik Democrats of Georgian nationality. 4 years had passed from the beginning of the organization of the Institute in Moscow up to the time of our arrival in Tiflis. Together with time had gone money, and all the more rapidly because, toward the end of this period, money had had to be spent not only for the work of the Institute itself, but on much else besides which had not been foreseen by the original calculations. The trouble was that the catastrophic events in Russia, the colossal upheavals, the war and civil war, had shaken people out of their usual grooves, and everything was so mixed up and turned upside down that the wealthy and secure of yesterday found themselves the totally destitute of today. This was the situation of many of those who had left everything to follow my ideas, and who, during this period, though their sincerity and corresponding manifestations had become like next of kin to me, and so I had now to provide a means of livelihood for nearly 200 people. My difficulty in this respect was complicated by the fact that many of my relatives were in a still worse position than the others, and I had not only to support them financially, but to provide shelter for them and all their families, since most of them had been living in places in Transcaucasia which had been completely devastated and pillaged in the civil war and by the Turks. In order that you may picture to yourselves the generally prevailing horror, I will describe one of the many scenes which I witnessed. This was at the time when I was in Essentuki, and life there was still relatively calm. I was maintaining 2 community houses for my relatives and followers of my ideas, one for 48 people in Essentuki, and the other for 60 people in Pyatigorsk. The already high cost of living was rising daily, and was becoming more and more difficult, even with large sums of money. It was becoming more and more difficult, even with large sums of money, to obtain food for the 2 houses, and I barely succeeded in making both ends meet. One rainy morning, while sitting at the window, looking out at the street, and thinking how to obtain this and that and the other, I saw 2 odd-looking conveyances pull up at my door, from which a number of shadowy forms slowly emerged. At first it was even difficult for me to make out what they were, but as my agitated thoughts grew a little calmer, I gradually began to realize that these people